The isolation. The Galactic Summit convened once every solar cycle aboard Station Harmony, a massive diplomatic platform that floated in neutral space between 12 major star systems. The station itself was a marvel of collaborative engineering, with sections designed to accommodate species that breathed methane, those that required intense radiation, and everything in between. Its central hub, the Grand Assembly Hall, was perhaps the most ambitious compromise in known space. A vast chamber where environmental fields overlapped and intersected, allowing delegates from wildly different worlds to occupy the same room without killing each other. Today, over 300 representatives had gathered for negotiations that would determine trade routes, resource-sharing agreements, and mutual defense pacts for the next decade. The air shimmered with translation fields, and the constant hum of universal communicators created a baseline noise that everyone had learned to ignore. Servers moved between tables carrying refreshments tailored to dozens of different biochemistries, while holographic displays showed agendas in 17 writing systems simultaneously. Princess Lyra of the Crystalline Empire stood at the entrance to the hall, her four-fingered hands clasped before her in the formal posture her tutors had drilled into her since childhood. She wore the traditional robes of her house, deep violet fabric that caught the light and seemed to glow from within, but no amount of beautiful clothing could distract from what everyone would immediately notice. The left side of her face, from her temple down to her jawline, bore intricate patterns of scarring where her crystalline skin structure had fractured and healed incorrectly. In the light, the scars created a webwork of dark lines against her normally luminescent pale blue complexion, a visible marker of imperfection in a culture that valued flawless symmetry above almost everything else. She had known this summit would be difficult, but she had underestimated exactly how difficult until she stepped into that hall and felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her, then quickly away. The Crystalline Empire was one of the oldest and most influential civilizations in the galactic community, and its representatives were usually received with great ceremony. But Lyra watched as delegates who would normally have rushed to greet a crystalline princess suddenly became very interested in their data tablets or engaged in urgent conversations with their aides. Ambassador Thorn of the Verdant Collective, a plant-based species known for their diplomatic grace, had been walking directly toward her. Lyra had prepared her formal greeting, the specific arrangement of words and gestures that protocol demanded. But Thorn's steps slowed as he drew close enough to see her face clearly, and then he veered away with a mumbled excuse about needing to check something with his delegation. He did not look back. Lyra forced herself to keep walking, her head high, her expression carefully neutral. She had practiced this. She had known it would happen. Knowing did not make it hurt less. The seating arrangements at the Grand Assembly Hall were theoretically open, with delegates free to sit where they chose to encourage organic networking and relationship building. In practice, complex social hierarchies determined who sat with whom, and entire careers could be made or destroyed by proximity to the right individuals. Lyra made her way to a table in a reasonably prominent section, not so forward as to seem presumptuous, but not relegated to the edges where minor delegations gathered. It was exactly where a crystalline princess should sit. She pulled out a chair and sat down, arranging her robes carefully. The table could accommodate 8 people comfortably. Within moments, it became clear that it would be accommodating only one. A delegate from the Merchant Guild of Taros approached, a multi-armed creature whose species Lyra had studied extensively in preparation for this summit. She smiled and gestured to the empty chair beside her in what she hoped was a welcoming manner. The merchant's numerous eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of consideration in his culture. Then he glanced at her scars and his eyes blinked again, this time in what Lyra recognized as discomfort. He moved to a different table without a word. The next hour proceeded in variations of the same theme. A diplomat would approach, realize who she was and what she looked like, and find a reason to sit elsewhere. Some were more polite about it than others. The representative from the Singing Moons cluster at least offered an apologetic smile before claiming she needed to sit with her trade partners. The methane breather delegation simply stared for a long moment before their translator crackled something unintelligible and they moved on. Lyra kept her hands folded on the table in front of her, her back straight, her face composed. She had learned long ago that showing emotion only made things worse. In crystalline society, physical perfection was not vanity or superficial concern. It was believed to reflect inner harmony, spiritual development, and genetic fitness. Her people had spent millennia refining themselves, pursuing an ideal of flawless beauty that was as much philosophy as aesthetic. The crystalline noble houses in particular saw their appearance as a sacred trust, proof that their bloodlines had achieved something approaching perfection. Lyra had been born perfect by those standards. Her crystalline structure had been flawless, her features symmetrical, her luminescence pure and steady. She had been raised to understand that her appearance was not just her own, but belonged to her people, a symbol of everything the crystalline empire represented. Then the plague had come. It had started in the outer colonies, a strange infection that attacked crystalline biology specifically, causing cascade failures in cellular structure. It spread faster than anyone had anticipated, and within weeks it had reached the inner worlds. Scientists and healers had worked desperately to find a cure, but the pathogen was unlike anything they had encountered. It adapted, evolved, resisted every treatment. Projections suggested that without intervention, 70% of the crystalline population would die within a year. Lyra had been 23 years old when she volunteered for the experimental treatment. The Empire's best genetic engineers had theorized that by introducing controlled mutations into the crystalline structure, they might create immunity to the plague. But the process was dangerous, unpredictable, and almost certainly irreversible. They needed test subjects. They needed someone whose genetic profile could provide data for the entire population. They needed someone from the royal bloodline. Lyra had not told her family what she planned to do. She had simply walked into the research facility and offered herself. The lead scientist had stared at her for a long moment, this perfect princess willing to destroy her own perfection, and then he had accepted. The treatment had taken 6 hours. The pain had been indescribable, like her entire body was being rewritten from the inside out. When it was over, half her face bore the fractured patterns of failed crystalline structure, and her left arm had similar scarring from shoulder to wrist. But the treatment had worked. Her altered biology had resisted the plague, and more importantly, the data from her transformation had allowed the scientists to develop a vaccine that saved billions of lives. The plague had been stopped. The crystalline empire had survived. Lyra had become a hero and an outcast in the same moment. She sat at her empty table and watched the grand assembly hall fill with life and conversation and connection, all of it happening around her, never including her. A server approached and placed a plate of food before her, some kind of crystallized nutrient arrangement designed for crystalline biology. Lyra thanked the server quietly and picked at the food without eating. Her appetite had vanished somewhere between the 15th and 20th rejection. Across the hall, she could see the crystalline empire's other delegates, a group of 4 diplomats and trade negotiators who had arrived on a different ship and were doing their jobs with admirable efficiency. They did not look in her direction. Her father, the emperor, had insisted she attend this summit, had said it was important that she represent their house, but he had also made it clear that she should keep a low profile. "Do not embarrass us more than necessary," he had not quite said, but Lyra had heard it anyway. A chime sounded, indicating that the formal sessions would begin soon. Delegates started moving toward the main assembly chamber, and Lyra realized she had been sitting alone at this table for nearly 2 hours. She had not spoken to a single person beyond thanking the server. This was going to be a very long summit. She stood, preparing to follow the crowd into the assembly chamber, when a voice spoke from behind her. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Lyra turned and found herself looking at a human. She recognized the species from her briefings, though she had never met one in person. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago, and they were still establishing their place in the complex web of interstellar politics. This particular human was male, she thought, with dark hair graying at the temples and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He wore what appeared to be formal Earth attire, a dark suit that looked slightly uncomfortable on him, and he carried a data tablet under one arm. "The table is empty," Lyra said carefully, not sure if this was another polite prelude to rejection. "That's not quite what I asked," the human said, still smiling. "I asked if the seat is taken. Because if you're saving it for someone, I'll find another spot. But if you're sitting alone by choice or by circumstance, I'd be honored to join you. I'm Captain James Chin, Earth Delegation." He extended his hand in what Lyra recognized as a human greeting gesture. She had read about this. Physical contact as a sign of friendship and respect, a peculiarity among species that communicated largely through touch. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against her crystalline palm. "Princess Lyra of the Crystalline Empire. You may sit." James Chin pulled out the chair beside her and sat down with a satisfied nod, as if he had just secured the best seat in the entire hall. He set his data tablet on the table and looked around with the expression of someone genuinely pleased with their surroundings. "First time at one of these summits?" Lyra asked, falling back on protocol because she genuinely did not know what else to say. "Third time actually," James said. But it's my first time as head of delegation. Usually I'm just an aide, taking notes and trying not to spill anything on important documents. This time I get to make the decisions and spill things with authority. He grinned. How about you? You seem like you've done this before. I have attended diplomatic functions since I was a child, Lyra said. Though this is my first Galactic Summit as primary representative for my house. Big responsibility, James observed. Lots of pressure, I imagine. Everyone watching, every word analyzed, every gesture interpreted. He paused, then added more quietly, and some people only seeing what they expect to see rather than what's actually in front of them. Lyra felt something catch in her chest. She looked at this human more carefully, trying to determine if he was offering genuine understanding or performing polite sympathy. His expression was open, honest, without the careful neutrality she had come to expect from those who noticed her scars and did not know how to react. You're staring at me, she said, not quite an accusation but close. I am, James agreed immediately. I apologize if that's rude. It's just that your crystalline structure is fascinating. The way it catches the light, especially where the patterns are more complex, it's beautiful. We don't have anything like that on Earth. Lyra blinked. Beautiful. He had called her scars beautiful. Either he was mocking her or he genuinely saw something different than everyone else in this hall. The scarring is considered a severe flaw in my culture, she said bluntly, testing him. The scarring tells a story, James countered. And I've found that the most interesting people always have stories written on them somewhere, whether literally or metaphorically. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed. On Earth we have an art form called kintsugi. When pottery breaks, instead of hiding the cracks, we repair them with gold. The idea is that the object is more beautiful for having been broken. The history of damage and repair becomes part of its value. That's a very human perspective, Lyra said slowly. Guilty as charged, James said cheerfully. We're a young species, probably naive about a lot of things. But we've learned a few things in our relatively short existence. One of them is that perfection is boring. It's the flaws, the scars, the weird quirks and unexpected elements that make something worth paying attention to. A server appeared and placed food in front of James, some kind of earth dish that Lyra did not recognize. He thanked the server enthusiastically and picked up his utensils. Then he paused and looked at Lyra's untouched plate. You're not hungry? I have been sitting alone for 2 hours, Lyra said, the words coming out more honestly than she had intended. Appetite is difficult under such circumstances. James set down his utensils. 2 hours. And I'm the first person to sit with you. You are. He was quiet for a moment, and Lyra watched emotions flicker across his very expressive face. Humans, she had read, were unusually transparent with their feelings compared to many species. What she saw in James Chen's face was not pity, but something closer to anger on her behalf, mixed with determination. Well, he said finally, then I'm glad I got here when I did. 2 hours is far too long for anyone to sit alone at a party, even a diplomatic party where the refreshments are terrible and everyone is plotting trade sanctions. He picked up his utensils again and gestured at her plate. Eat something. You're going to need your strength. The afternoon session is 4 hours long, and Ambassador Krotek from the warrior clans always gives speeches that make you want to gnaw off your own arm out of boredom. I speak from experience. Despite everything, despite the weight of the morning's rejections and the careful walls she had built around herself, Lyra felt her mouth twitch into something almost like a smile. She picked up her own utensils and took a small bite of the crystallized nutrients. You speak very casually for a diplomatic function, she observed. I've been told that, James said, not sounding particularly concerned about it. My supervisors back on Earth have a file of complaints about my lack of formality that's probably longer than I am tall. But here's the thing I've learned. Diplomacy isn't about following every rule and maintaining perfect protocol. It's about actually connecting with people, understanding them, finding common ground. And sometimes the best way to do that is to just be honest and see what happens. An optimistic philosophy. An effective one, at least for me. I'm not saying it works for everyone. But I'm a middle-aged human from a species that's barely figured out faster than light travel. Nobody expects me to be perfect. It's liberating. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Lyra found that with someone actually sitting beside her, actually talking to her like she was a person rather than a problem to avoid, her appetite had begun to return. The crystallized nutrients were not particularly flavorful, but they were nutritious and carefully prepared. She ate slowly, aware that delegates passing by were now staring at their table with poorly concealed curiosity. We're attracting attention, she said quietly. We are, James agreed. Is that a problem? It might be. For you. Association with me is not considered advantageous. James took a long drink from his beverage, something that looked like earth water, and set the glass down with a decisive clink. Princess Lyra, can I tell you something? When Earth joined the galactic community 50 years ago, nobody wanted to sit with us either. We were the new species, the primitives who had barely figured out which end of a plasma rifle to point away from ourselves. We had nothing to offer, no advanced technology, no ancient wisdom. We were just humans, stubborn and loud and completely out of our depth. He gestured around the hall. Every species in this room at one point or another looked at humanity and decided we weren't worth their time. We were too young, too aggressive, too emotional, too different. And you know what we did? We sat down anyway. We showed up to every meeting, every summit, every negotiation. We proved that our differences were not weaknesses but strengths. We built alliances not by being perfect, but by being genuine. Lyra listened, finding herself drawn in by the passion in his voice. So if sitting with you damages my reputation, James continued, then I'd say my reputation was built on a pretty shaky foundation to begin with. And honestly, I'd rather sit with someone interesting who has stories written in scars than sit with people who are so obsessed with maintaining appearances that they've forgotten how to see past them. The chime sounded again, more insistent this time, indicating that delegates really needed to start moving into the assembly chamber. Around them, the grand assembly hall was emptying. But James' chin did not stand up. He simply looked at Lyra and waited. You don't even know me, Lyra said softly. You don't know what I've done or why I look like this. For all you know, these scars could mark me as a criminal or a failure. True, James acknowledged. I don't know your story yet, but I'd like to. And more importantly, I know that in the 2 hours you sat here alone, not one person bothered to ask. They looked at your scars and made assumptions. I'm choosing to look at you and ask questions. He stood and offered his hand again. Shall we go face the assembly together? I promise Krotek's speech is more bearable if you have someone to exchange suffering looks with. Lyra looked at his extended hand, at the simple gesture of connection and support. She thought about the 2 hours of isolation, about the long summit ahead, about the fact that she had been prepared to endure all of it alone. And then she thought about kintsugi, about broken pottery repaired with gold, about the human philosophy that damage could be part of beauty rather than a denial of it. She stood and took his hand. Together, she said. As they walked toward the assembly chamber, side by side, Lyra noticed something remarkable. The delegates who had avoided her eyes all morning were now watching openly. And in that attention there was something different than before. Not acceptance, not yet, but perhaps the first stirrings of curiosity. Because if a human, a species known for their unexpected wisdom and their ability to see value where others saw none, had chosen to stand beside the flawed crystalline princess, then perhaps there was more to her story than anyone had bothered to learn. And for the first time since arriving at Station Harmony, Lyra allowed herself to hope that this summit might be different after all. The transformation. The afternoon assembly session had been exactly as unbearable as James had promised. Ambassador Krotek of the warrior clans had indeed delivered a speech that seemed designed to test the endurance of every delegate in the chamber, droning on about honor codes and territorial disputes in a monotone that could have been weaponized. But James had been right about something else too. Having someone to exchange suffering looks with made it infinitely more tolerable. Lyra had caught James's eye approximately 40 minutes into Krotek's speech, and he had responded with an expression of such exaggerated despair that she had nearly laughed out loud in the middle of the assembly chamber. She had covered it with a cough, but several delegates had turned to look at her anyway, their expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval. The flawed princess was not supposed to find joy in diplomatic proceedings. When the session finally ended, delegates had flooded out of the chamber with the desperate energy of prisoners granted temporary reprieve. James had suggested they find somewhere quieter to discuss the trade proposals that would be addressed in the evening session, and Lyra had agreed with more enthusiasm than was probably diplomatic. They had ended up in one of Station Harmony's observation lounges, a smaller chamber with massive windows that looked out onto the star field beyond. The lounge was designed as a neutral space where delegates could have informal conversations away from the structured environment of the assembly hall. Comfortable seating arrangements were scattered throughout, and the lighting was kept low to better showcase the view. When Lyra and James arrived, only a handful of other delegates were present, engaged in quiet conversations in distant corners. They found seats near one of the large windows, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply looking out at the vast expanse of space. Lyra had seen countless star fields in her life, had traveled between systems since childhood, but there was something about this particular view that felt meaningful. Perhaps it was the company. "Can I ask you something personal?" James said, breaking the silence. Lyra tensed slightly, preparing herself for the questions she had been expecting since he sat down beside her. Questions about her scars, about what had happened to her, about whether the damage was truly as permanent as it appeared. "You may ask. Are you actually interested in the Taros Merchant Guild's proposal about rare mineral exports, or were you just being polite when you said you'd review their documentation?" Lyra blinked, thrown off balance by the complete mundanity of the question. What? "The Taros Guild," James repeated, pulling up something on his data tablet. "They've been trying to corner the market on crystalline minerals from the outer reach. I noticed you seemed interested during the presentation, but I couldn't tell if that was genuine interest or if you were just being a good diplomat. Because if you're actually interested, I think there might be a way to structure a counterproposal that would benefit both our delegations." "You want to work together on a trade proposal," Lyra said slowly, making sure she understood correctly. "Why not? Earth has been trying to establish stronger trade relationships with the Crystalline Empire for years, but we've never quite managed to get our foot in the door. Your people have technology and resources we need, and frankly, we have raw determination and questionable judgment in abundance, which has to be worth something." He grinned. "Plus, I think the Taros Guild is overplaying their hand. They're counting on nobody challenging their pricing structure. If we present a united front, we might be able to negotiate better terms for everyone." Lyra found herself leaning forward, her diplomatic instincts engaging despite her surprise. "The Taros Guild has exclusive contracts with 3 of the major mining operations in the outer reach. Any counterproposal would need to address that monopoly. Unless we propose developing alternative mining operations," James suggested. "Earth has the labor force and the willingness to work in difficult conditions. Your people have the technology to extract crystalline minerals without damaging their structure. What if we proposed a joint venture? A human crystalline mining operation?" Lyra turned the idea over in her mind, examining it from multiple angles. "That would require significant trust between our governments. Such partnerships are not common." "They're not common because nobody tries," James said. "Everyone is so busy maintaining traditional alliances and avoiding new risks that we miss opportunities. But think about it, your empire needs to rebuild relationships after." He paused delicately. "After recent difficulties. Earth needs to establish itself as a serious player in galactic economics. We both benefit from surprising everyone with a bold move." Recent difficulties. A diplomatic way of referencing the plague that had nearly destroyed her civilization, and the social upheaval that had followed. Lyra appreciated that he acknowledged it without dwelling on it, without making it the center of their conversation. "You're right that it would be unexpected," she admitted. "The question is whether unexpected means innovative or foolish. In my experience, people don't know which it is until after you've already done it," James said cheerfully. "So we might as well try." They spent the next hour working through the details of a potential proposal, their heads bent over James's data tablet as they drafted preliminary terms. Lyra found herself enjoying the process more than she had enjoyed any diplomatic work in months. James had a creative approach to problem-solving that was refreshing after years of crystalline rigidity, and he listened to her suggestions with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. As they worked, something shifted in the observation lounge. Other delegates began to drift toward them, drawn by curiosity or opportunity or perhaps simply by the novelty of seeing a crystalline princess and a human captain engaged in animated collaboration. A junior diplomat from the Verdant Collective approached first, hesitantly asking if they might have insights on agricultural trade that could complement mineral exports. James waved him to a nearby chair without hesitation. Then came a representative from the Silicon Confederacy, interested in the technological aspects of crystalline mining. Then a trade negotiator from the Merchant Guild of Taros itself, clearly concerned about potential competition and hoping to get ahead of whatever Lyra and James were planning. Within 30 minutes, they had assembled an impromptu working group of 8 delegates, all contributing ideas and expertise to what was rapidly becoming a comprehensive trade framework. Lyra found herself at the center of it, not as the flawed princess to be avoided, but as a knowledgeable expert whose input was valued. She spoke about crystalline technology with confidence, drawing on years of study and hands-on experience that most crystalline nobles never bothered to acquire. When the Taros representative questioned whether certain extraction methods were feasible, Lyra explained exactly how they could be accomplished, citing specific research that she had read during her recovery from the experimental treatment. James watched her with an expression of satisfaction, occasionally steering the conversation when it threatened to veer off course, but largely letting Lyra take the lead. She realized what he was doing. He was creating space for her to shine, deliberately stepping back so that others would have to engage with her directly rather than going through him as an intermediary. It was a gift, and Lyra was not sure she had words to thank him for it. The evening session was delayed by 30 minutes because so many delegates were still gathered in the observation lounge, unwilling to break up a productive discussion. When they finally did make their way back to the assembly chamber, Lyra walked in the center of a group rather than alone. The difference was staggering. The evening session focused on security concerns and mutual defense pacts, topics that Lyra had less expertise in but found herself engaged with anyway. James sat beside her, and during breaks in the presentations, they continued their earlier conversation, expanding their trade proposal to include security considerations. The Merchant Guild representative, whose name was Vexer and who had initially approached them with suspicion, gradually warmed to their ideas and began contributing suggestions of his own. "You know," Vexer said during one break, his multiple arms gesturing expressively, "when I first saw you this morning, Princess Lyra, I thought you would be a liability to any negotiation. I assumed the rumors about crystalline nobles shunning you meant you had no real authority or expertise." Lyra stiffened, but before she could respond, James cut in with a voice like ice. "And now you're realizing that assumptions based on appearance are generally the mark of lazy thinking." Vexer's eyes blinked in surprise at the sharp tone. "I meant no offense. I was simply acknowledging my error. Princess Lyra clearly has extensive knowledge and valuable connections. I was wrong to judge her based on superficial factors." "Then perhaps lead with the apology rather than the justification," James suggested, though his tone had softened slightly. "My apologies, Princess," Vexer said, inclining his head in what Lyra recognized as a gesture of respect in his culture. "Your expertise has been invaluable today. I hope we can continue working together." Lyra nodded graciously, accepting the apology even as she felt a warm flutter in her chest at the way James had immediately defended her. Nobody had done that in a very long time. The evening session was nearly over when the alarms began. At first, it was just a low hum that most delegates ignored, assuming it was some routine system check. But then the hum became a wail, and the lights throughout the assembly chamber shifted to emergency red. Holographic displays flickered and died, replaced by a single message in multiple languages: "Critical system failure. Core reactor destabilizing. All delegates proceed to evacuation stations." Panic erupted immediately. 300 delegates from dozens of different species, each with their own survival instincts and protocols, all trying to move toward exits simultaneously. The chamber dissolved into chaos. James grabbed Lyra's arm, not roughly but firmly, keeping her close as the crowd surged around them. "Stay with me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "We need to get to the evacuation stations, but we need to move carefully." Lyra nodded, her diplomatic training taking over even as her heart raced. They moved with the crowd, James using his body to shield her from the worst of the pushing. Around them, she could hear delegates shouting in dozens of languages, translation devices struggling to keep up with the overlapping voices. They had nearly reached one of the exits when a second alarm sounded, this one even more urgent. "Evacuation routes compromised. Station structural integrity at risk. Remain in secure locations." The crowd stopped, confused and increasingly frightened. Remain in secure locations? But the assembly chamber was not secure if the core reactor was failing. The contradictory instructions created a paralysis that was almost worse than the panic. A voice boomed over the station's communication system, rendered in the flat tones of the automated emergency system. "Core reactor experiencing cascade failure in crystalline energy matrix. Conventional repair protocols ineffective. Station destruction projected in 47 minutes unless intervention successful." Crystalline energy matrix. Lyra felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. She knew crystalline energy systems. She knew them better than almost anyone in the galaxy, because she had spent months studying them during her recovery, trying to understand what had happened to her own body's crystalline structure. The technology that powered Station Harmony was related to the same principles that governed crystalline biology. "James," she said quietly, her voice somehow cutting through his focus on the crowd. "I need to get to the reactor core." He looked at her sharply. "What?" "The crystalline energy matrix. I know how it works. I might be able to help." "You're not an engineer," James said, but it was not an argument, more like a question seeking confirmation. No, but I understand crystalline structures in ways that most engineers don't. My scars. She gestured at her face. They're from a failed crystalline transformation. I've studied the failure points, the cascade patterns, the way crystalline energy can be redirected and stabilized. If the reactor is experiencing the kind of failure I think it is, conventional approaches won't work. They'll need someone who understands the unconventional. James stared at her for a long moment, and Lyra could see him processing, weighing risks, making the kind of rapid decision that separated good diplomats from great ones. Then he nodded sharply. Station security is going to try to stop us from going anywhere near the reactor core, he said. It's a restricted area even in non-emergency situations. We'll need authorization. I'm a crystalline princess, Lyra said with more confidence than she felt. That should count for something. And I'm a human captain with a talent for ignoring rules when necessary, James added. Let's go. They pushed through the confused crowd, moving against the flow as other delegates tried to figure out where they were supposed to go. James led them through a side corridor that he somehow knew about, and Lyra followed without question, trusting his knowledge of the station's layout. They encountered their first security checkpoint within minutes. 2 guards, heavily armed and looking extremely stressed, blocked their path. This area is restricted, one of them said, his translator rendering the words in crisp, official tones. All delegates must remain in designated safe zones. I'm Princess Lyra of the Crystalline Empire, Lyra said, drawing herself up to her full height and channeling every ounce of royal authority her tutors had instilled in her. The reactor core is experiencing a crystalline energy failure. I have expertise that may be critical to stabilizing the system. I am requesting immediate access to the engineering section. The guards exchanged uncertain looks. We have no authorization for. You have 45 minutes before this station explodes, James cut in, his voice hard. You can spend time checking authorizations or you can let someone who might actually be able to help get to the reactor core. Your choice, but choose fast. The guards hesitated for one more second, then stepped aside. Engineering section is 3 levels down, central corridor. Emergency lifts are still operational. They ran. The engineering section was chaos of a different sort. Engineers and technicians from multiple species were working frantically, shouting instructions and monitoring systems that were clearly failing faster than they could compensate. The reactor core itself was visible through a massive observation window, a brilliant structure of crystalline energy matrices that formed the heart of Station Harmony's power generation. Even from a distance, Lyra could see the problem. Dark fractures spreading through the crystalline structure, exactly like the patterns that had spread through her own body during her transformation. A tall female engineer with tentacles instead of arms looked up as Lyra and James burst into the control room. This is a restricted area, she began, but James held up his hand. She's crystalline. She understands crystalline energy matrices. Let her look. The engineer's tentacles writhed in agitation. We have crystalline engineers here already. They're telling us nothing can be done. The cascade failure is too advanced. We're preparing to evacuate what personnel we can and hoping the emergency barriers hold long enough to get the delegates off the station. Let me see the failure pattern, Lyra said, moving to the observation window before anyone could stop her. She pressed her scarred hand against the glass, and for a moment she let herself truly look at the reactor core, not as a princess or a diplomat, but as someone who had lived through a similar failure in her own body. The dark fractures spreading through the crystalline matrix were following predictable paths, branching out from a central point of destabilization. It was exactly the same pattern she had seen in medical scans of her own crystalline structure. The conventional approach would be to try to contain the fractures, redirect energy away from the damaged areas, Lyra said, speaking quickly. But that won't work. The fractures will just spread faster, following the path of least resistance. You're fighting against the natural flow of crystalline energy. Then what do you suggest? The engineer asked, her tone suggesting she expected no useful answer. Stop fighting it, Lyra said. Embrace the fracture. Crystalline structures are self-organizing systems. They want to find equilibrium. Right now, the reactor is trying to maintain a perfect crystalline matrix that no longer exists. But if you introduce controlled imperfections, strategic disruptions to the energy flow, the system will reorganize around the fractures instead of fighting them. The engineer's tentacles went still. That's insane. Introducing more instability into an already unstable system. It's not more instability, Lyra insisted. It's directed instability. My people tried to maintain perfection in my crystalline structure when it was failing, and that nearly killed me. What saved me was accepting the imperfection, working with the fractured structure instead of against it. She turned to face the engineer directly. The scars on my face exist because my body found a new equilibrium. The reactor can do the same thing, but only if you let it. This is unprecedented, the engineer said, but Lyra could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. We have no protocols for. We have 38 minutes, James said quietly. Protocols are a luxury we don't have. The engineer looked at Lyra for a long moment, at her scarred face, at the evidence of survived catastrophe written in crystalline fractures. Then she made a decision. Tell me exactly what you need us to do. For the next 30 minutes, Lyra stood at the center of a storm of activity, directing engineers in techniques that violated every principle of conventional crystalline energy management. She had them introduce harmonic dissonances at specific points in the matrix, creating deliberate fractures that would give the cascade failure alternative pathways. She had them reduce power flow in some areas while increasing it in others, creating an asymmetrical energy distribution that looked chaotic but was actually carefully calculated. The crystalline engineers who had initially been working on the problem watched in horror and fascination as Lyra directed the systematic destruction of the reactor's perfect crystalline structure. One of them, an older male with prestigious house markings, actually tried to intervene. This is madness, he said. You're destroying the matrix. You'll cause a total collapse. The matrix is already collapsing, Lyra shot back. I'm giving it away to collapse safely. Trust me or get out of my way. He got out of her way. James stood beside her throughout, not understanding the technical details but providing steady support, relaying her instructions to engineers in different parts of the facility, coordinating the effort with the kind of quiet competence that Lyra was beginning to recognize as his defining characteristic. With 8 minutes remaining on the emergency countdown, the reactor core began to respond. The dark fractures stopped spreading. The energy readings, which had been dropping steadily toward critical failure, stabilized. The brilliant crystalline structure that had been so perfect before was now webbed with dark lines, imperfect and asymmetrical, but holding. It's working, the tentacled engineer breathed, staring at her monitors in disbelief. The cascade has stopped. Energy generation is stabilizing at 73% of normal output, but stable. Lyra felt her legs go weak and James caught her elbow, holding her steady. She stared at the reactor core, at the scarred crystalline matrix that now powered Station Harmony, and felt something profound settle in her chest. Beauty and imperfection. Kintsugi for crystalline structures. The emergency alarms shut off. The red lights faded back to normal. And in the sudden quiet, the tentacled engineer turned to Lyra with something like awe in her expression. You saved us, she said simply. You saved everyone on this station. Word spread through Station Harmony with the speed that only crisis-born news can achieve. By the time Lyra and James made their way back to the assembly chamber, every delegate knew what had happened. The flawed crystalline princess, the one nobody had wanted to sit with, had solved a problem that the station's best engineers had declared unsolvable. She had saved 300 delegates and over 1,000 station personnel from certain death. The assembly chamber was silent when Lyra entered. Not the silence of avoidance or discomfort, but the silence of respect. Every delegate present stood as she walked in, a gesture of honor that transcended cultural boundaries. Ambassador Thorne of the Verdant Collective, who had avoided her that morning, stepped forward. Princess Lyra, he said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber. On behalf of all delegates present, I express our profound gratitude. You have demonstrated courage, wisdom, and expertise that saved countless lives. We are in your debt. Lyra stood in the center of that silent chamber, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, and this time the weight was different. Not judgment but recognition. Not rejection but acceptance. The reactor core now bears scars, she said, her voice steady. It will never be perfect again. But it is stable, functional, and capable of powering this station for decades to come. Sometimes the broken things, the flawed things, are stronger than the perfect things. Because they have learned how to survive. She felt James step up beside her, a solid presence at her shoulder. Together they had transformed not just a reactor core, but the entire social dynamic of the summit. High Chancellor Voris approached, the elderly Etherionian who had been her father's advisor, who had looked at her with such disappointment that morning. He stopped before her and bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect in crystalline culture. Princess Lyra, he said, I have been a fool. I saw your scars and believed they represented failure. I failed to see that they represented survival, sacrifice, and the kind of strength that comes only from having been broken and choosing to heal. He straightened, meeting her eyes directly. Your father will hear of your actions today. The Empire will hear of them. And they will understand, as I now do, that you are exactly the leader we need. Over the next hour, delegates approached Lyra one by one. Some apologized for their earlier avoidance. Some simply wanted to express gratitude. Many wanted to discuss collaboration, trade agreements, scientific partnerships. The table that had been empty that morning was now at the center of everything. As the formal sessions finally concluded for the day and delegates began to drift away, Lyra found herself alone with James in the observation lounge where they had worked on their trade proposal hours earlier. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. "Thank you," she said quietly. James looked at her with genuine confusion. "For what?" "For sitting beside me when no one else would. For seeing me instead of just my scars. For defending me to vex her. For running toward danger with me when you could have evacuated. For..." She gestured helplessly, unable to encompass everything. "For all of it." James was quiet for a moment, looking out at the star field. Then he smiled, that warm expression that had first caught her attention. "Lyra, I didn't do any of that to earn gratitude. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Because you deserved better than what you were getting. And because, honestly, you seemed interesting and I've never been good at ignoring interesting people." "I was supposed to be a liability," Lyra said. "A flawed princess who would embarrass her empire. Instead, somehow, I ended up saving a space station." "You want to know what I think?" James asked. "I think you saved that space station specifically because you're flawed. Because you understand crystalline failure in a way no perfect crystalline ever could. Your scars aren't weaknesses. They're evidence that you've survived something most people can't even imagine. They're your expertise written on your skin." Lyra touched the scars on her face, feeling the familiar texture of fractured crystalline structure. For years, she had seen these marks as the price of her sacrifice, the cost of saving her people. But James had shown her a different way of seeing them. Not as damage but as proof. Proof that she had stood in the fire and emerged changed but unbroken. "Earth still needs a trade partner," James said, breaking into her thoughts. "And I still think a human crystalline joint venture in crystalline mining would be revolutionary. Plus, after today, I suspect you're going to have quite a bit of political capital to work with. Your people will have a hard time ignoring the princess who saved the Galactic Summit." "Are you proposing a continuing partnership, Captain Chin?" "I'm proposing a friendship," James said. "The partnership is just a bonus." He extended his hand once more, that simple human gesture of connection. "What do you say, Princess? Want to continue surprising everyone?" Lyra took his hand, felt the warmth of human skin against crystalline palm and smiled. Not the careful diplomatic smile she had been trained to give, but a real one, genuine and unguarded. "I think I would like that very much." As they stood there in the observation lounge, looking out at the infinite star field, Lyra understood something fundamental. The universe was vast and strange and full of different ways of being. Some species valued perfection. Some valued strength. Some valued wisdom or power or tradition. Humans, she had learned, valued something different. They valued resilience. The ability to break and heal, to fail and try again, to be flawed and powerful at the same time. And perhaps, Lyra thought, that was the most valuable quality of all. The Galactic Summit continued for 3 more days, but everything had changed. Lyra was no longer the flawed princess to be avoided, but the expert consultant everyone wanted to speak with. Her trade proposal with Earth moved forward with surprising speed, gaining support from delegations that had ignored her just days before. She was invited to consult on crystalline technology projects, offered positions on research boards, courted by diplomats who suddenly saw value where they had previously seen only imperfection. Through it all, James remained at her side, not as a savior or a protector, but as a friend and equal partner. They worked together on proposals, attended sessions together, and during breaks they would retreat to the observation lounge to talk about everything and nothing, finding joy in each other's company that transcended diplomatic purpose. On the final day of the summit, as delegates prepared to depart for their home worlds, Lyra stood once more in the Grand Assembly Hall. This time, she was not alone at an empty table. She was surrounded by colleagues, partners, and the beginning of genuine friendships that crossed species and cultural boundaries. High Chancellor Voris approached her one last time before departing. "Princess Lyra," he said, his tone formal but warm, "I will be reporting to your father tomorrow. What message would you like me to carry?" Lyra thought about her father, about the emperor who had sent her to this summit with instructions to keep a low profile, To not embarrass the family more than necessary. She thought about the person she had been when she arrived, carrying shame like a weight, and the person she had become through crisis and connection. Tell him, she said carefully, that his daughter represented the crystalline empire with honor. Tell him that she forged alliances that will benefit our people for generations. And tell him. She paused, finding the courage for one more truth. Tell him that her scars are not a flaw to be hidden, but a strength to be celebrated. Because they represent everything the empire stands for: sacrifice, survival, and the courage to be transformed by hardship rather than destroyed by it. Voris bowed deeply. It will be my honor to deliver that message, Princess. And for what it's worth, I believe he will hear it differently than he would have a week ago. The entire galaxy knows what you accomplished here. Even an emperor cannot ignore that. As Voris departed, James appeared at Lyra's elbow with 2 glasses of the Syrian crystal wine that had started their unlikely friendship. A toast, he suggested. To what? To flaws, James said, raising his glass. To scars and imperfections and all the broken things that turn out to be stronger than anyone expected. To kintsugi, crystalline and otherwise. Lyra raised her own glass, the crystal chiming as they touched. To humanity for teaching the rest of us how to see beauty in damage. And to the crystalline empire, James added, for producing a princess brave enough to let herself be seen. They drank, and the wine was sweet and complex and perfect, like captured starlight. Around them, the grand assembly hall was emptying one final time. Delegates said their farewells, made their final arrangements, prepared to carry the results of this summit back to their home worlds. The station's reactor core hummed steadily in the distance, its scarred crystalline matrix generating power that would sustain this place of connection and diplomacy for years to come. And Lyra, standing in the center of it all with a human friend at her side and a future that suddenly seemed full of unexpected possibilities, understood that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of courage. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to sit beside you when everyone else walks away. Sometimes all it takes is a smile.